Welcome to Femographics. I'm Shelby Evans. When I was 5, I got a Barbie skateboard scooter and one with a matching helmet for Christmas. One of my favorite sports moments was seeing Gael Monfils play in his last match at Indian Wells this spring. I only became a Chelsea fan because my brother was, and that was a good enough reason for 12-year-old me, and I'm a sports journalist. We have reached the end of my planned content. It's all been building to this moment. Now that you know how much a team is trying to get your attention, it's a bit of a pivot to see how the everyday reporter talks about covering sports. Journalists are idealistic, hard-working individuals, and it's so hard to fight through the industry to get to the point where it feels like pay equals effort. Some of us never get there. But still, there are hundreds, even thousands of local news reporters and sports reporters that show up every day to tell inspiring stories. I love local news. Worst resolution, Shelby, take it away. So you've worked in 4 different markets. In those cities, have you discussed what the target audiences are for your outlets?
I don't know if I've had like high level conversations with, the people in management positions in the newsroom about that specifically, but just by reporting in a community and being out in the world, you realize pretty quickly who your audience is and how that is different depending on where you live. So, like, just super generally speaking, the audience in the Pacific Northwest is, and that is both grouping Medford, Oregon, and Seattle together. It is a much wider, WHITER, wider audience than the audience that I'm reporting for in Austin and in Phoenix. And so with that in mind, yeah, that does kind of influence how I go about my reporting and my storytelling. Um, for example, in Austin and Phoenix, I feel like because my audience is more diverse, that gives me a more diverse um, set of story subjects, which then leads to more diverse reporting. So in Austin and Phoenix, I have used my Spanish speaking abilities way more than I ever did in Medford and Seattle. I've reported on, Latinos, people of color, minority groups way more often than I ever did in the Pacific Northwest. Um, and part of that is intentional on my part, and part of that is just the environment that I lived in during that given time. And I try to be a reporter and a storyteller who, even in markets that are less diverse, I try to bring like an approach that exposes the audience to different cultures. I've tried to do that as much as possible, but it can only go so far if there are just fewer, amount of people in that subset in that specific region. So that's a long-winded way of saying a lot of times I haven't been involved in those high-level conversations with management in the newsrooms, but like with my fellow reporters, we have talked about those things. In a sports department, we've talked about those things. And I've just tried to make sure my reporting matches the community that I'm in and the audience that is watching that reporting.
Yeah, and as far as reaching those audiences, there's a lot of conversation about newsrooms trying to keep up in this digital instant age. So, what have the conversations been like for you with your higher ups or with your fellow colleagues about being a journalist in a newsroom reaching people?
Yeah, and that goes beyond just like someone's ethnicity.
Mm,
That takes into consideration a person's media consuming habits. And I can tell you that it has drastically changed. Like my job as a reporter has drastically changed between when I first started in Medford, Oregon, and 10 years later now in Phoenix. My job as a TV reporter in 2017 was one of two things. It was to either fill a sportscast 3 to 4 minutes worth of content at the same time every single night, or contribute a packaged story for that sportscast in a very traditional way. 10 years later, I still have to do that, but I also have to be thinking, okay, how do I take this content and make it applicable for a streaming audience? How do I take this content and make it pop on social media? How do I turn this video that I shot with a TV camera, horizontally? How do I turn that into a vertical video that'll do well on TikTok and Instagram Reels? I feel like local TV is super reactive and not proactive, to where similar story to when the internet was invented, with vertical video dominating now, local TV was not leading that charge. It was reacting to the environment that kind of slapped them across the face. And I would say the guidance that we've gotten about, how to truly succeed in this era, it hasn't been great. That we've been given no formal training or education on how to make a great vertical video. It's kind of just trial by error, and you're going to get better by doing it. And yeah, like I have gotten better by doing it, but it would be nice if, we saw this change coming 5 years ago and we're working towards this, rather than all of a sudden one day, it being a top down mandate. Hey, we are doing social media now. Here's what you need to do every single day to meet your quota. And so that part has been frustrating, because the job of an MMJ was already one person doing the job of three people. Now it's doing the job of four people. And I understand, like I don't want to be, resistant to change and an old man yelling at the clouds. Like it's either change and adapt or become less relevant. But it would just be nice to have kind of like a North Star to guide us down the right path.
Yeah, in 21, when I was a morning news producer, I remember saying, guys, we got to get on TikTok as a station. And we created it, and no one knew what to do with it. And similar thing, too many expectations on one person in a newsroom, and I could not implement anything with it. And so it's interesting that 5 years later, here we are, and
Yeah.
it could have started a while ago. But so do you think this reactive nature, specifically to vertical video implementation, is a lack of diversity in management or lack of understanding from young people? Where is it stemming from?
That's a great question. I I think it's in all likelihood a lack of young people in important roles. And that's what I try to tell every young person who is entering this business, is that yeah, oftentimes local TV gets slapped with it's a dying industry label. To me, that also means incredible opportunity for young people to carve out, a specific niche in this industry. Um, I have seen firsthand young people step into roles at local TV stations and immediately revitalize the vertical video approach, because young people understand it, and they grew up with that really being the only form of content that they've consumed. And so, of course, they're going to be good at it. So, I would like to see more of an investment from newsroom management into younger people, because young people do have these answers. And a lot of times the people in high ranking positions, you know, they might have the business acumen or, the strategic background of like, how to influence the direction of media, but they are not the ones on the ground every single day, like truly leading this charge. So investment in young people is incredibly important.
Yeah, I agree wholeheartedly. We could continue down this path of newsroom changes, but I am going to pivot a little bit because
Let's do it. Yep.
we would start doing it and then never stop is
Yeah.
what would happen. So you once said originally you wanted to work for ESPN. Now you've been very localized for a decade. You're telling not as many big time stories. You're not at every single Diamondbacks game or whatnot. You're doing a lot of localized human interest. So, what about that has made you passionate about the stories you tell?
I just think that there is no more rewarding feeling than to feel like you have made an impact on the people who you live around and the people who you see every day. I think I got like the most fulfillment when I was working in Austin, and it just felt like I had lived there long enough and seen enough things and been out in public enough to like truly know what people care about. And when you get to that point, it just feels like the stories you find are limitless and endless. And I really I got addicted to that. And it was so much fun to just every single week rattle off stories like that. And I think it really came to a defining moment like when COVID hit, and a lot of sports reporters looked at that as like, well, there are no sports happening right now. Looks like I'm useless and worthless. Looks like I can't do my job. But I looked at it as this is exactly when I show how I'm different. And this is where, my creativity comes into play and just my ability to find things that other people aren't finding. And so I got so much satisfaction out of those like super local stories that are about not necessarily, you know, millionaire athletes who the entire world knows, but always finding a sports peg to speak to a larger issue. And I think the pandemic, for as awful as it was, for obvious reasons, there was like a shared humanity and experience that like we're all going through this. Here's the good. Here's the good that this one person is doing. And yeah, it's not as glamorous as ESPN, but I would argue that the glamour of ESPN has taken a hit since, that I got into this business wanting to be a sports center anchor, but I turn on sports center now and it's like that's that's not the type of journalism I want to be doing. The sports center anchors are not in locker rooms and clubhouses. They're in a studio, reading highlights about players they've never even met and will never interact with. And like their relevance has taken a hit because of social media. So that has become like way less of the goal for me. And it's more so like, how can I make an impact on a community through my storytelling? And to me, that does not reside at ESPN.
Going to those teams and what they are producing from their content, what how does that affect what you do? What are your relationships like with those comms teams?
It affects how I operate because our access is way more limited than it once was. The teams look at us as you guys can still, benefit us and perform a service to us, but we don't need you like we once did. We have our own, content team that can produce the type of stories that we want coming out to reflect a positive image and to, capture the attention of a fan base. We're never going to tell stories that are critical or, that involve uncomfortable topics, because why would we do that to ourselves? So a lot of the teams, they still have, professional relationships with us, and they understand that, they can still get something out of the audiences that we have, but the dynamic is not how it was 15, 20 years ago. Because 15 or 20 years ago, they needed us to get their story out, to, drum up interest from the public. But now they don't need that as much. Um, and it goes even a step further. I think athletes are realizing, while teams have realized we don't need journalists to tell our story, some athletes, the biggest and best athletes, are realizing we don't need our team's content team to tell our story. I'm going to hire my own content team to only produce content that is related to me. And I truly think that's where this is going. I've seen, athletes like DK Metcalf employ multiple photographers and videographers, and they just follow him around all day. And I think that is another potential, like, really exciting career path for someone who is, just graduating school and has that ability to, produce really high level content while also, establishing a relationship that's built on trust with an athlete. I think that's where it's headed. And I think more and more people are going to realize, hey, like, I may have learned all these traditional reporting skills, but I can apply these and not go work at a newspaper for a TV station. I can produce content directly from an athlete.
Yeah. So some people probably are looking at sports and looking at this change in the content that they're receiving from sports and probably thinking, well, it's just entertainment. Who cares where it's coming from? But from your point of view as a journalist, do you see a negativity to this trajectory of the sports media industry?
Like a negativity from
As
fans and the audience.
yeah, there are repercussions of, information not getting out into the people because they're not able to critically no journalists will limiting journalist access limit the negative reporting on a team and maybe not, oh, we don't like this player, but hey, we found like evidence of something going wrong in the organization. And will that have a negative effect on audiences? Or is it all entertainment and it doesn't need to be combed that critically?
No, I think it has a negative impact on audiences for sure. Um, and I think from what I've seen is, like, there is there is a lack of understanding in our current media ecosystem from fans about what the job of a journalist is. And I think, like, I'll give you an example of this. There was a media scrum, so like an availability in the San Francisco Giants clubhouse with Buster Posey about everything that transpired during Pride Night. And the reporters did a phenomenal job of continuing to ask questions and try to, gain information from this availability, despite the fact that Buster Posey and the Giants said from the beginning, I'm only here to answer baseball questions. Like, that was his canned response for everything. If you look at the comments that those clips received on social media, so many of them were from fans saying, these reporters are so annoying. Like, didn't you listen to them from the beginning? They said they were going to only answer baseball questions. Like, gosh, no wonder everyone hates journalists. Like, these guys are just the scum of the earth. And to me, like, that spoke to a big disconnect between what the job of a journalist is and what the public perceives the job of a journalist to be. It's not the job of a journalist to follow instructions from a team that limits your ability to ask certain questions. Like one of the literal job descriptions for a journalist is to ask questions to find out answers. And if you don't have people willing to do that, then you don't have a healthy press. And I think a lot of people have like soured on the idea of what a healthy press looks like and the benefits of that. And I think that a lot of that gets to the media ecosystem that we live in, the attacks on the press from the current, administration. There are a whole host of reasons why people feel this way. Um, Sometimes, like, it can be self-inflicted from journalists. Like, I'm not here to get on a high horse and say that journalists are always right and always perfect. But there are just so many examples like the Giants one that show to me like, man, that the public really doesn't understand the benefit of this and what our actual role is.
No, I don't think they do. And one of the things that I'm trying to figure out through this podcast is there's all of these sports content creators, and teams are taking a lot of cues from them. And I follow a decent amount of these creators because, as a, queer woman sports fans, like there's just niches that aren't covered in mainstream ways. But these creators aren't critical and they don't have full access and maybe not aren't trained professionally in
Right.
journalism. So a lot of people are scrolling online and seeing that and taking their cues of information from that. So how and I know we talked about vertical videos getting more hype in newsrooms, but how does that get addressed? Because that's the segmentation of a really clear divide.
Yeah. I I look at this from my vantage point in two different ways. On the one hand, like there are things that I can learn from those people because they approach their work in a very, new media way. And a lot of times, like I do notice things they do, and I see the audience they have and say, well, that's no accident that they have this audience. What are they doing to gain that audience? On the other hand, like I don't necessarily think that those people have all the answers either. Um, I've seen firsthand, teams and media relations departments get really frustrated with those content creators because they haven't been, trained in, what this professional relationship is supposed to look like. Um, there was one example of a content creator at a D-backs game, like overstepping and thinking that like he had more access than he did, and it it just gets into a uncomfortable territory when stuff like that happens. And like I don't want to put that label on every content creator, but I do think like this is a reality that pro sports teams have to address. Yes, they love the attention, they love the audience and the publicity, and a lot of times like these stories are promotional and lighthearted, and so there's no they perceive it as there's no downside to this. Well, the downside is that, this person oversteps in some way and, makes the athlete upset, um, disrupts the natural flow of how game days are supposed to look. So that's kind of what I've seen is that like there are things that I can learn from these people, no doubt. There are also things that they can learn from us. And yeah, I don't and honestly, like, in 5 years, media presentation is going to look different anyway. So in 5 years, like, these people are going to have to adapt, and these people are going to be the ones with outdated techniques. So it's super cyclical, and nothing stays the same.
I want to thank Jake for joining me. He did me a solid by stepping in at the last minute. The conversation very organically covered some of those ideas we already talked about, including what the marketers said. Teams don't entertain journalists like they used to. And if the local reporters aren't in the clubhouse every day and ESPN isn't anymore, that leaves teams the masters of their message. There are admirable efforts by the teams to make their content all access and deliver for the different segments of audiences and adapt to the younger ones. And content creators are building successful businesses of niche groups of sports audiences that consume media almost entirely from their phones. But at the end of the day, no press means no watchdog. Which, if sports is just entertainment, that's fine. But there's funneled money through no-show endorsement deals to evade the salary cap in the NBA. There was a staff-wide cover-up of a video coach grooming and sexually assaulting a player in the NHL. And there is suddenly the creation of a Peace Prize for the World Cup. As Jake said, the first step to better coverage is to bring journalism from being reactive to being proactive. And the answer always seems to be diversity, but I'm not the only one that's going to keep saying it, because we need those diverse backgrounds and those diverse ideas to revitalize what is possible as journalists. I don't know if we have a luscious future of independence if we all left the newsroom to become content creators. Stepping away from those spaces loses entrance into these gate-kept areas, and likability online doesn't translate to competence like Jake's anecdotes suggested. At the beginning, I invited you to watch if you were a journalist or if you were a fan curious about the news cycle. If you are the latter, I hope you can become more critical of what you are consuming. These local reporters are working really hard to tell amazing stories about the high school football coach and also about your favorite professional players. That information is already available online where you are. They're being pushed out on X and Instagram and TikTok, even if it is reluctantly. Their stories are carefully crafted and passionately reported. If there's one thing we take away from the content creators and apply to journalists, it's that audiences are craving authenticity, and we can all be a bit more of ourselves when we share our work. Maybe we put on a tie that we got at the thrift store, or we tape up the magazine cuttings we collage with. Maybe our tarot cards are in the background. Sports is a space for everyone, and if you're ready for this callback, the space belonging to everyone needs to have a map that can be followed by everyone. Sorry if you didn't watch episode 3. You missed a really important narrative through line that I just punctuated the end of. For now, though, I'm not going to close off the opportunity of creating more episodes for this podcast. I'm just going to leave it with saying I'll see you later.